Welcome to Real Faith Always Has Good Reasons. Evidence. You know, people I talk to at times who are atheists or who are just not religious, they will often say, well, you have faith and I have fact, right? You have hope and I have science. As if my hope and my faith are devoid of fact and even inconsistent with real science, which is not true. And we're going to talk about that today by using biblical texts which define faith and hope in relation to faith, as well as other information to show that the way atheists and other non-religious people view Christian hope and faith is actually very similar to how Christians view atheists' theory, scientific theory and scientific fact. So, for example, at times also, I've heard Christians refer to, and I've done it myself, but for reasons I'm going to give in just a second, refer to atheists or evolutionists who don't believe in an intelligent cause of life, or even that life is the source of life, that life actually evolved from non-life. Christians will at times say, well, that's just a theory, right? You have a theory about evolution of life from non-life, not fact. And again, in one sense, I believe there's accuracy in that statement, but in a more strict sense, I think atheists and scientists in general would be correct in saying that's not true. Because scientific theory is really meant to explain what is considered observable facts, right? So I don't think evolutionists or atheists would agree, in fact, I know they wouldn't, that their theory doesn't have anything to do with facts. In the same way, Christian hope and faith, atheists will often say, like I mentioned a moment ago, and act like we have faith, but it doesn't have facts. But that's not true. And if you're a Christian like me, then you know that's not true. And even the Bible explicitly teaches that's not true. So we have a very interesting dynamic here, where one side is looking at the other side and saying that the way they see things doesn't have facts, scientific theory, when it's actually a theory meant to explain what is considered observable facts. There's a question, of course, as to what is a real fact and whether or not it's being interpreted correctly according to the theory that's supposed to be explaining it. But then you have the same people, as I said, turning around and claiming that Christians have hope or faith. They equate the two often as the same. That's just a belief, right? Like just some belief we have in our mind that's not rooted in evidence. So each side is looking at the other in a similar way, incorrectly at times. And of course, this gets in the way of productive discussion about what is really on our minds, both atheists and Christians. Evidence, right? Do we have evidence that supports our theory, our scientific theory? Do we have evidence that supports the hope that we have, our faith? That's really the key, isn't it? But if we each look at each other and think, well, you just have a theory and that doesn't have any facts, and you just have faith or hope and that just doesn't have facts, well, then we're going to be arguing over that instead of the facts. And I want to try to move us to the evidence, to the facts, and grant that each side is claiming they have facts. They have evidence, right? Atheists claim that their scientific theory explains, right, like evolution, their evolution of unintelligent mutation of one life form into another, or the unintelligent cause of life from non-life, if they don't take an eternal view of life in some sense. So they have a theory that's evolution, right? These random things that take place that usually involve already existing conditions and atmospheric things that we'll get to in a moment. But their theory is that this unintelligent cause is behind it all. There's not an intelligence behind it. There's not a God. And so they can't really point, though, to an instance where life comes from non-life. It never happens. Not once. So it's a theory that attempts to explain facts that there's life, right? We all agree there's life right now. So that's accepted as a fact. But evolutionists or atheists who don't believe in an intelligent cause of life, or even of evolution from life to another life, don't have evidence of evolution in the first instance, that is life from non-life. Nothing. They don't even have one example of it. Christians who believe that life only comes from life, and so therefore life must be eternal and the cause of life, because life doesn't come from anything else but something alive, have more evidence supporting that view, theory. It's a fact, right? Life always comes from life. It's not a theory. It's a theory in the sense that you could say we put it forth as an explanation for the facts we observe. But again, there's not one exception. It happens every day, countless times a day, across every living type that we see reproducing as life from life. So we don't have anything that contradicts that explanation for life being here, or for life being eternal. Atheists don't have any observable instance of life coming from non-life. So how could it be a credible scientific theory even, right? That's a theory in the sense that I think most Christians often refer to when they say, you just have a theory. Right? Now, it's a little different when you get to the species mutations and things, because, right, they can point to different actual mutations, right? They don't really develop into whole species, though. But there's at least something to work with on an observable level when it comes to the theory of evolution that involves mutations of life. Okay? Christians don't believe that's correct and doesn't correctly explain all the different types of life that exist and how they can't crossbreed in ways that would show they're related. But when it comes to life from non-life, they don't even have anything. Not one single thing. So that's the kind of theory Christians often refer to and say, that's not evidence-based. There's no facts behind that. Yeah, you may have some facts or things you can say with this mutation theory you have about species development, but you do not have anything to support your theory, your scientific theory that claims to explain what you observe, life coming from non-life. So why are you putting it forward? When you can observe, like we can, the exact opposite happening all the time. That's really the problem with atheistic thinking and their inability to accept life only comes from life based on everything we know and can show and observe. We're not talking about things that we don't know about, or we only base what we theorize or accept as fact based on what we can observe. So to claim that, as I do, that life is eternal because life always comes from existing life, you're just rejecting what you can see with your own eyes, like I can with mine. And then you're trying to claim that it doesn't come from pre-existing life, I guess, but you have no evidence for it. So your theory is so different from ours in that respect. It needs to be pointed out, because as Christians, we need to be accurate as well. We need to be able to differentiate between a scientific theory that has some observable facts. It's just not accepted as scientific fact because it's not as evidence-based. A scientific fact has more repeated acceptance as being conclusively the case than a theory does, even though a theory can have, and usually does if it's correct, facts, which is what give rise to the explanation for it, the observable theory, the theory that attempts to explain what's being observed. So there's a difference, though, isn't there, between a theory that has facts and a theory that does not. So atheists are often doing the very thing when it comes to the origin of life that they say about us with respect to God. That we just believe it with no evidence. We just hope like just an idea in our mind that we came up with, but that's not based on anything we can observe. When in fact, it's definitely the observable theory or fact kind, because it's based on life. And life only coming from life. Whereas their theory of life not coming from life has no facts. So important distinction to note there when we're dealing with faith, having good reasons, and being different from hope, as we'll get to more in a moment. But relating this to scientific theory and scientific fact, we may disagree with atheists about conclusions they draw from their theories about observable facts, like evolution between species. But that doesn't mean they don't have a scientific theory with some facts. So as Christians, we also need to be prepared to say, okay, I can see you have some facts with that theory, but I disagree with how you're interpreting the facts. You could even have a scientific fact, something that's, it's never really completely accepted as 100% for sure. It's more indisputable and established than a scientific theory. That is a scientific fact. But you can even disagree with that, right? Just because someone says something is a fact and even repeats it in experiments again and again, if they're wrong, right? Just because they say their experiment repeated over time, resulting in the same conclusion, is correct, that doesn't mean it is correct. Example, Miller-Urey. I wrote an article back in 2010 called Advanced Earth Conditions, where I talked about a famous experiment, well-known experiment, that's been questioned in some respects, but that led to a lot of misinformation about the potential origins of life. It's this paper here, Stanley Miller, A Production of Amino Acids Under Possible Primitive Earth Conditions in Science 117, May 15th, 1953. Now in this article, it was on my Elihu Topical Index, and it'll be on the new Elihu site soon again. I go through the entire article. I quote it all, because it's not that long, and I put all of the article in this bold type. And this article misled a lot of people, and it still does today, into thinking that you could have primitive Earth conditions existing on their own without any intelligent cause, leading to the formation of amino acids, which are often taken as the building blocks of life, which they're not. They're the building blocks of protein. But let's just set that aside for now. Notice the first sentence, or first quoted part at least, and I believe it is the first sentence of the article, from this article that I just referenced, A Production of Amino Acids Under Possible Primitive Earth Conditions. The idea that organic compounds that serve as the basis of life were formed when the Earth had an atmosphere of methane, ammonia, water, and hydrogen instead of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, oxygen, and water was suggested by Oparin and has been given emphasis recently by Urey and Bernal. In order to test this hypothesis, an apparatus was built to circulate CH4, NH3, H2O, and H2 past an electrical discharge, which they put in place in the apparatus that they built. The resulting mixture has been tested for amino acids by paper chromatography. Electrical discharge was used by Miller and Urey to form free radicals instead of ultraviolet light, because quartz absorb wavelengths short enough to cause photodissociation of the gases. Electrical discharge may have played a significant role in the formation of compounds in the primitive atmosphere. You see a problem already? Let's go on just a little bit further. The apparatus used is shown in figure 1. I'll show it to you in a moment. Water is boiled in the flasks. Who boiled the water? Who built the apparatus? Who set the electrical discharge? Mixes with gas. With the gases in, the F1 flask circulates past electrodes, condenses, and empties back into the boiling flask. The U-tube, created as part of the apparatus, prevents circulation in the opposite direction. The acids and amino acids formed in the discharge, not being volatile, accumulate in the water phase. The circulation of the gases is quite slow, but this seems to be an asset because production was less in different apparatus with an aspirator arrangement that they put in place to promote circulation. So they're doing it all, right? They're putting in the gases, the electrodes, the circulation. The discharge, a small corona, was provided by an induction coil designed for detection of leaks in a vacuum apparatus. All these things were set up and created and built by these scientists. And then we'll just go on to one more part here. The amino acids are not due to living organisms because their growth would be prevented by the boiling water during the run and by the HgCl, BaOH during the analysis. The amino acids are not due to living organisms. Who built the apparatus? There it is. Who put in the electrodes? Who put in the gases? Who caused the circulation? Who managed the temperature? Living organisms. The intelligent scientists who did this experiment, who did the very thing we believe, based on evidence, God did. Or something similar, right? They don't see themselves in their own work. All they're doing is concluding after excluding themselves and any other living organisms that they prevented from being a part of the experiment. But including themselves, right? Who put all this together? They did. Conclusion, obvious, right? Intelligent life was responsible for the amino acids. Yet if you ask atheists or people who believe Miller-Urey's experiment, at least in this respect, there's some questions about what they did in other ways, but I'm talking about their exclusion of themselves. And that's exactly what atheists do today. They run around, they do these experiments that require intelligent life, and then they exclude the very cause that leads to the result of their experiment from their conclusion, the intelligent life. And so Christians can look at experiments like this, right? They could repeat experiments like this over and over again and refine it, make it better and show, right? But they're doing it. They're the God equivalent in what we're saying happened on a larger scale. And they're just removing themselves from the conclusion and saying, well, you see, these things can happen on their own in a primitive atmosphere that just happens to be, we can't tell how it all got there, but if we just allow it all to be there, and then we create a semi-replica of what we think it was like, and we do all this intelligent work and controlled experimentation, well, we can prove that this can happen on its own. When it didn't happen on its own. It wouldn't have happened on its own. And that's what the experiment shows. So it doesn't matter, atheists, scientists, people who don't believe God exists. Doesn't matter if you do these experiments and then you come up with a theory to try to explain the observable facts, right? Yeah, amino acids were produced. Your theory's incorrect. They didn't happen on their own. You did it. Intelligent life did it. So when Christians say God did it, and we point to your own experiments and say you're just proving that intelligent life is required even on this primitive scaled level of attempted replication of what you think happened, you're just proving what we're saying or providing evidence that our theory is consistent with. Your theory is not. Your scientific theory may have facts related to it. This whole experiment and everything that happened is part of it. Fine. You have a theory that amino acids are not due to living organisms. Your theory is incorrect. So it doesn't matter if you claim to have facts. It doesn't even matter if you claim it is a scientific fact. If we can point out that you're missing the most important and obvious fact, maybe you should listen. Maybe it's time you start to listen, if not to us, to your own experiments. Just go back a little farther in the process and try not to exclude yourselves. But that's just it, isn't it? You have to exclude yourselves. Otherwise, you don't have a theory consistent with your belief. That's not our problem. That's your problem. And it's always been your problem, even though you've tried to make it our problem. You failed. It's your problem. And so when we point to scientific studies and experiments like this and we say, no, you're missing a key point. We don't care how smart you are. We don't care how many degrees you have. You can't even include your own selves as the causal factor or agent in the equation. So we're going to set aside all your academic achievements when you do that, okay? We're not going to listen to you when you ignore the most important information, okay? You can have your theory. You can think it's based on facts. But if you're incorrect, well, how about that? So there is a similarity, for sure, between how atheists often view Christian faith and hope as not being based on evidence, and how Christians sometimes look at atheists and evolutionary scientists and saying, well, you just have a theory but no facts. But what atheists are often missing, as we're going to get to in just a moment, is we do have facts. We never just have some people may, but in the Christian sense, as I'm going to prove in a moment from the Bible and Christian texts, it's never without evidence. It's entirely evidence-based, even hope. Hope isn't just some idea we come up with that we want to be true. It's almost always because of something we think is true for good reasons. And yet sometimes what you think is true for good reasons isn't true for those very same reasons. Yeah, you may have facts, they just don't support your theory. So when we sometimes also point out that your theory doesn't have facts, we are actually correct at times. Just like at times you may be correct when you say some of us have a hope or faith, right? Some Christian may say something that's not evidence-based. That's possible, of course. But that's not Christian faith, as I'm going to get to in a moment. It's very well defined in our accepted biblical texts, like over a large context of discussion. So we each need to be more cautious with the other, for sure. And of course, my Christian brothers and sisters, I want you to always be mindful of having good reasons and evidence for whatever you claim is your hope or faith. They don't have to be like 100% perfect, right? Even scientists don't believe their facts. They don't even necessarily believe what they would call a scientific fact is undeniably true, right? Like there's no possibility it can't be true. They just believe it's been tested so much that it's been accepted more so than the theory that's used to explain the facts that they believe. But as you can see, right, you can have facts. You can have experiments that show things you can accept as factual from a scientific point of view. And then have a theory that completely ignores the most important fact or facts involved. And so often Christians that's what we're saying. We're not saying your theory doesn't relate to any facts at all. Sometimes maybe it doesn't, just like with certain Christians and their view of hope and faith. But often it's more like this. It's more like your theory is incorrect, or the facts you think you're explaining with your theory, you're not. Your theory isn't connected to those facts, right? That's what we're talking about anyway. Like right here. There's many examples I could give, but this one's so clear. And so I wanted to highlight it to show and to try to bring some understanding between these at times difficult concepts of scientific theory, scientific fact, faith, hope. I'm going to argue and I'm going to show in just a moment that biblically, hope and faith always have some evidence, if hopefully the best evidence. And as I just showed, scientific theory can attempt to explain observable facts, and they can really be facts that the theory is attempting to explain, and the theory still be wrong by not including all the facts. And so this subject can at times be difficult for people, which is why I wanted to spend a little time on it first, before we get to the definition of faith and hope, at least as it relates to evidence in the biblical text. Speaking of which, let me now read to you from an accepted biblical lexicon, the Greek English lexicon of the New Testament, 3rd edition. It's known as BDAG. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingrich are the names that are associated with that acronym. But it's a well-known Greek English lexicon. Right? And I'm going to read to you what it says about faith. The Greek word for, I'll start with hope and then I'll go to faith. The Greek word for hope is elpis. Epsilon, lambda, pi, iota, and sigma. And it says, the looking forward to something with some reason for confidence. Some reason for confidence. This is how Christians and Christian dictionaries explain hope. Respecting fulfillment, hope, expectation. It cites several texts. I'm not going to read all of them because we're going to get to Hebrews 11 in a moment. But the first one, 1 Corinthians 9:10, talks about how a man who plows, doesn't plow for no reason, right? When you think of someone plowing in a field, he doesn't plow without hope, is what 1 Corinthians 9:10 is talking about there, right? So in 1 Corinthians 9:10, when it says that, isn't it tying the whole idea of plowing not being without hope due to the fact that the one who plows already knows that if they plow and they do things correctly, right, things might fail and there might not be the kind of crop that they desire. But they've seen this happen before, right? People don't plow because they don't believe something's going to happen. They don't have reasons for believing that's going to be growth. They plow because they have hope for growth. Because there's some reason for confidence respecting fulfillment. It goes on to talk about that which is the basis for hoping. And then it gives numerous biblical texts. Again, you can read this on your own. We're going to get to a full discussion in a moment. So I'm not going to get to all of them. Now let me get to faith, which is the word pistis, or pistis. Pi, iota, sigma, tau, iota, sigma. So this is on page 818. That which evokes trust, faith. State of believing on the basis of the reliability of one trusted, trust, confidence, faith. It gives numerous texts. Talks about all kinds of things. That which is believed, teaching. And so to explain what this is, but again, that which evokes trust. Well, what evokes trust in us? Evidence, right? Faith is based on that which evokes trust. reliability, state of believing on the basis of the reliability of the one or thing trusted. So the definitions of hope, elpis, and faith, pistis, clearly relate to evidence, something that is the basis for what we hope, for what we believe, something that evokes trust. But there's a difference, as you're going to see, whereas hope is somewhat similar in a sense to the scientific theory aspect of what we talked about, right? Because scientific theory is a little less established, less accepted, even if it's related to facts or based on observable facts, than scientific fact, which would be more like Christian faith, the scientific fact, something that's more concrete, less disputable, more widely accepted as repeatedly demonstrated. And so faith is stronger than hope, just like a scientific fact, you could say, is stronger or more established than a scientific theory, even if that theory is meant to explain scientific facts, right? Because the facts are more accepted than the theory. And in the same way, faith has more strength and trust than hope, as you're going to see. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Turn there with me, whatever copy of the Bible you want to read. I'm going to read the New World Translation pre-2013 because I'm familiar with it. I know how to use it. I know where it may not be accurate, but I actually think it's more correct than most people believe. And I really don't care what you think if you don't agree, unless you have good reasons. And they better be good, because I've discussed most of the issues and I plan on doing that more next week. Let me bring this up for you so you can read along with me. Hebrews chapter 11. Look at what the first verse says about faith. Faith is the assured expectation of things hoped for, which is estin pistis, is faith, or faith is. Elpizamenon hypostasis. It's the substance of the things hoped for. The reality, the hypostasis. Like in Hebrews 1:3, the substance, something concrete. It's not just an idea or a thought we have and we want it to be true. Faith is the assured expectation, the hypostasis, the reality of what we're hoping for, of what's being hoped for, of the things hoped for. And this shows the relationship between faith and hope, similar to scientific theory and scientific fact. We hope for things because of the reality that is the basis for our faith. So, for example, like I gave in explaining earlier, the difference between a scientific theory without fact and a scientific theory with fact, or based on observable fact. Scientific theory that has no observable fact behind it is that life evolved or came from non-life, something not alive. There's no evidence, nothing. It's a theory with nothing. Scientific theory that's used to explain what is claimed to be an observable fact as it relates to mutation among different living species, that's different, right? There's observable things that occur, like mutations, that atheists can point to as part of their scientific theory and say, okay, well, this explains these mutations. They don't have that for life, for the origin of life. We do. We have the hypostasis, the reality, the substance of what is true that we can point to like every day, all over the place. Humans, animals, birds, everything that reproduces according to its type, just like Genesis describes, comes from existing life. So when we have faith that God is eternal, right? He'd have to be alive for eternity in order for that to be true, right? Well, if life only comes from life, like millions, if not billions of times a day, all throughout our observable history on this planet, I don't think you could get more of an established fact than that, right? You want to accept the possibility that some undetermined or unobserved thing still can account for life that's not alive. It doesn't matter. If we're talking about observable facts, our theory or belief about life being eternal is it's reality. It's hypostasis. It is absolutely 100% rooted in everything we see all the time, no exceptions. It's the exact opposite of what you have on the atheist side when it comes to their explanation of life coming from non-life. So our faith, when it says is the assured expectation of the things hoped for, like if we hope that God exists in this sense, right? It's talking more about certain other things, but I'm using it in relation to our faith about God and Him existing, being alive, over and against the difficult concept that life is eternal, right? Because they always say, what? Well, if this life came from that life, well, then what life did God come from? Again, the observable evidence shows that even though we can't answer that question because we don't go that far back, all that we can observe, and as far as we do go back, justifies the faith that we have that God is eternal. Because life only comes from existing life, and we're alive right now. So our faith is based on reality, hypostasis. And that's what it's talking about. The evident demonstration of realities, though not beheld, or of things that appear from things that aren't viewable, that we can't see, right? Because just like 1 Corinthians 8:6, all things are out of the Father. Father's a spirit. No one has seen God at any time. John 1:18, John 4:24. Right, so we don't observe God in that way. We may see Him representatively through angels or in vision or certain other things, but He's invisible in that sense, and certainly back when He created all things. So we don't see Him. But what we do see convinces us of what we don't see. That life's eternal, that life that's eternal, that gave life to life, and that's responsible for all the life that exists, because life can only come from life. We don't see that eternal life, but we see everything from it that lives. And so the things we see demonstrate to us what we don't see, eternal life. The reality of what we see, the hypostasis, is what our faith is based on. We don't just believe in God because we want there to be a God. We have all these things around us. We have this life. We have all these balanced systems and of course, balanced life, right? Bilateral symmetry and all these different things. Our eyes are set in non-mutated forms, of course, right? There's always deformities. That's not the way things normally are reproduced, though. Those are exceptions, imperfections, but that are not according to the design pattern that we see in everything. It all has utility. So that is what Hebrews 11:1 opens up this chapter defining faith as. The reality of what we hope for, of the things hoped for. That's what faith is. Our faith, our hope, these are always based on evidence. With our hope also having evidence connected to the realities that we see, but our faith being the more complete, the more established acceptance, the thing that more so than even hope evokes trust, right? So hope, we may start out having hope based on some evidence that we have. So we start to believe and it seems right, but then we see it clearly. Then we see the whole picture and pattern of how life only comes from life, right? You may have hope that God exists based on just knowing there's life. But once you realize life only comes from life and always has only come from life based on all the evidence that we have and have observed, that evokes the kind of trust that is faith. So we often start out with hope and then it becomes faith, which is why it says faith is a reality of the things hoped for. It's when things become real, not just somewhat real or clear, and there's some evidence, right? It's real. So, for example, you may have a hope in the resurrection as a Christian. Have you ever seen anyone raised from dead to life? Probably not. But what about the people who did? Right? See, we may have a hope of a resurrection, and that hope might rise to the level of faith because of our trust that develops in the reality, the historicity, and the pre-Christian evidence associated with Jesus. But it's not really ever the same as it would be for someone who witnessed a resurrection. You see the difference now? Someone who actually sees someone who is dead brought back to life, they have faith, right? They've seen it, like the way we see life coming from life. So we can still have hope that's evidence-based, right? The biblical records, the reliability of all these things that are said in relation to Jesus. The fact that, people today even in some sense talk about recreating life, right? Even prehistoric life and human life, cloning human life, different things that get close to this idea of coming back to life. But they're really not the same as someone who actually witnesses the resurrection. So that's another way to show the difference in a Christian sense between hope and faith. They both have evidence, right? Do you have a hope of a resurrection without any evidence that the Bible and its teaching is correct? I doubt it. Well, what would it be based on? Just a desire? Well, maybe. Maybe there's people out there who really don't fully have confidence in the Bible, but they have this desire to come back to life. And so it's just a thought in their mind. And so that kind of hope might be the type that an atheist could tackle and say, see, you don't really have evidence. But that's almost never the case when it comes to Christianity, right? If you're a Christian, you've, on some level, put the hope in your mind of a resurrection because you've been convinced of other things that you have faith in. So even if your hope in the resurrection doesn't rise to the level of faith like it does in God's existence because of life being eternal, because life only comes from life. And life obviously has the marks of intelligence that we'll get to in a moment. And I mentioned some of them. It doesn't matter. You can still have hope and you should have hope. The Bible speaks of hope. But faith is greater in a similar way that scientific facts are more established or accepted than the theories used to often explain them, which could be completely incorrect or missing such critical information like we observed earlier with Miller-Urey, that it doesn't matter if they're attempting to explain actual facts. Their theory is wrong. They just need to account for more facts that they're ignoring, and then they'll get it right. So just because a scientific theory actually does have facts does not make it right, does not make the theory correct. Verse 2, for by means of this, the definition of faith, that's what it means by this, of faith being the reality of what we hope for, right? So like if you had hope in a resurrection, and then you saw someone resurrected, that would then evoke the faith that would be more than the hope that is not based on the full reality yet. It may have evidence, it may have facts, it may have some realities, but faith is the more trusting belief and acceptance based on the reality of the things you hope for. And so in a similar way, again, like with life always coming from life, and God existing and knowing that that's the case because of what we can observe with our own eyes, in the same way that you might have faith in resurrection if you saw someone dead come to life. For by means of this, the men of old times had witness borne to them. By faith we perceive that the systems of things were put in order by God's word, so that what is beheld has come to be out of things that do not appear. Just like I said a moment ago in relation to verse 1, and all things being out of the Father, the things that we see are from the things we don't see. And this is kind of more of the text I was referring to there, but it ties in with verse 1, the evident demonstration of realities that we don't see. So, for example, if we go back to the Miller-Urey article I wrote, and we look at some of these things, right? So what does it say? Faith, we perceive that the systems of things were put in order by God's word. Okay, so this is faith here we're talking about. That it's not just a hope. We're not just hoping with some evidence that all of the systems that we see, the solar system, the galaxy system, the systems in and on and above the earth, that's not just hope. That we have faith. That's reality. That's a reality of what we may hope is true because of what we believe and start to think based on some evidence. Just look, right? I mean, if Miller-Urey, right, this is evidence of their intelligent existence. Well, what about these things? What about the structure of an atom or a molecule or the Earth and its moon or our solar system or our galaxy? Right? And we know how many galaxies there are and how many other things there are on Earth in ways that we can point to and say, look at all of these realities, hypostases, the substance of what we hope for that gives us faith. When we look at all these things, this is reality. Right? This is actually happening, like someone being resurrected from the dead, if it were actually happening. This evokes trust that is faith, because it's reality. Right? It's not just a hope based on some evidence that we can kind of see. This is very clear. It's been studied. It's been presented to us in ways even beyond what was true of people in the old days, but they could see also the different movements of the stars, the planets, the moon, all the systems on the earth, the weather patterns, the seasons. Right? So precise you can set your calendars by them. They could plan their agricultural activities and seasons based on them. So that's what it's talking about here. By faith, by the reality of what we hope for, the substance, what's really there, we can see that the systems were put in order by God's word, so that what is beheld, what we can see, has come to be out of the things that do not appear, right? We weren't there when they were actually made, right? Actually, if we were obviously there when God was creating all these things, we could have observed it like the sons of God observed in our view. But we didn't see that. So we see the result, right? We see the resulting reality. And that's how we can tell, oh, okay, all of this stuff that's working together in all of these complex and precise ways that allow for life and light and darkness and different seasons and times, we can see based on that reality what we don't see. The life that always comes from existing life that we can see time and time and time again tells us about the life we can't see that's eternal, that caused all that life that comes from life to happen. Now it gets into more specific biblical accounts about people and things they did that were also based on evidence or things they could see, hypostases, realities, not just a thought or an idea that we want to be true. Look at what it says. By faith, Abel offered God a sacrifice of greater worth than Cain. Why would Abel want to do that if he didn't believe God really existed? them being so close to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, with the cherub there guarding the entrance, and all of these things they could see, and God actually being there talking to different people like he did with Cain and probably with Abel too. But it says Abel, because of what he observed, right? Because of what the reality of what he was involved with at that time, he was moved to give more, something of greater value to him, which at that time your livestock was pretty much your most valuable thing. But Cain was not. So something motivated one to do something the other was not motivated to do. That has to do obviously with their personality, their just heartfelt appreciation and response to the reality, right? Not everybody sees these same realities here and comes to the same conclusions we do, right? There are people, atheists again, they often present these things. They can look right at them, just like Miller and Urey, right? They can look exactly at the experiment and the apparatus that they make, that they built, that they control, that they regulate. They can see what it does under their control and creation and still fail to include themselves in their own conclusion. So it's no real wonder, is it, that they do the exact same things when it comes to what God made. And that's what they're doing. They're acknowledging, right? They put together, they would say, it's a perfectly balanced thing. It's all set, put together right, controlled perfectly, it leads to amino acids. Okay, well, who made that? Oh, you did? Well, so then the amino acids are actually the result of living organisms, right? Unlike what you said right here. That's actually incorrect, right? Right. And it's also incorrect here because these things don't happen on their own. Perfectly formed systems that result in these kinds of functional ways of life don't just happen on their own. They don't. We know they think they do, right? They think amino acids happened on their own, even though they created the conditions that led to their formation in the replication of a primitive Earth atmosphere. So again, we can all look at these things and come to completely different conclusions if we're not accepting all of the facts. Life only comes from life. Life is eternal. The things that are in life are obviously designed and intelligent based on their operation, based on their replication, based on their utility. Things aren't just crashing into everything all over the place in this random process, and all these comets and earthquakes and volcanoes and stuff are just creating all this perfectly formed life. No, it's not happening like that at all. But that's what they see it as anyway. So don't let it confuse you to think that, well, then why aren't they seeing it that way? Well, it's the same reason why they don't see their own experiments and conclusions correctly, in my opinion. Because I can see that they're ignoring the very thing that we say created these things when it comes to the creation of this. So Cain can come to a different conclusion as well than Abel, and that's exactly what he did. He didn't see it as significant enough of a reality to have the faith that if he gave more, right? He was more concerned about having what he needed rather than giving back to the one who gave him those things in the first place, believing based on the fact that you were given those in the first place, you'd be given those again. Abel had that faith. And so he had witness borne to him he was righteous when God, of course, appeared to Cain and punished him. God bearing witness respecting his gifts, and through it he, although he died, yet speaks, the way his blood is said to speak, and bear witness to the faith that he showed in recognizing that what he had received from God should be given back to God in order to receive more again. By faith, Enoch was transferred so as not to see death, and he was nowhere to be found because God had transferred him. For before his transference, he had the witness that he had pleased God well. So he lived for a long time, hundreds of years, and served God in the way that he could see, based on the reality that was all around him, all the things that he had learned from those who were before him, all of the things that were taking place during his time. He responded in a way that gave him faith that he would be taken by God the way the texts say he was. So it wasn't just that Enoch was not serving God in a righteous way for no reason. He didn't just say, well, I'll just do this because I want it to be right. I think it's right. No, he had all this witness from people before, from Adam and Eve, things with Cain and Abel, and others before him that he drew upon and could see, well, if I do this, if I act this way, this will please God. This will please the one who put these things here for us. Moreover, without faith it is impossible to please him well, for he that approaches God must believe that he is, and that he becomes the rewarder of those earnestly seeking him. And we have that faith according to what we can see take place, based on life only coming from life, and life obviously being intelligent, combined with the witness from history that intelligent eternal life is the biblical God. It may be a God spoken of in other texts too, relative to things that are actually true, but the Bible gets it right in so many ways, with so many records of things that took place. We can further identify this eternal intelligent life that we can observe must exist, even though we can't observe him as he exists, right? We know he exists from the things we can see, even though we can't see him. And that's the same with our ability to identify him as the biblical God. All the things that took place with respect to him that others saw, observed, wrote down, and then we can look back and go to these different places and consider the records to these different events and say, oh, okay. And we're going to get to one of those in just a moment that show this God existed. Right here. By faith, Noah, after being given divine warning of things not yet beheld, showed godly fear, and constructed an ark for the saving of his household, and through his faith he condemned the world, and he became an heir of the righteousness that is according to faith. Now, if you look at the thumbnail for the video that we're doing right now, you'll notice that it has an image. It has an image of something I've shown before, and that you can look up on your own, of course, of a place called Göbekli Tepe. And I have a text reading in Genesis that goes into detail about the ark animals and different things, and how the images at the Göbekli Tepe site are entirely consistent with one historical event. Not only do we have all the sunken cities all around the world, not just near coastlines, but deep in the ocean, like the Yonaguni Monument, or high up in the highest navigable body of water, Lake Titicaca in South America, that show at one time there were places that are built incredibly with massive faces underwater now. And yet these same atheists and evolutionists often give us a timeline that is in no way consistent with this pre-flood civilization. You know what does? The Bible. The Bible and other records provide us with a description of what was taking place before those cities bit the dust or got flooded. So let me bring up that thumbnail. And here you can see again, I'll try to make it more clear. Partially anyway. Make it a little bit more. You can look up Göbekli Tepe on your own. I highly recommend you do. Look at it. Look at the stone on the left. Here you have cattle type creatures. Here you have creatures of the field. Here you have birds. Over on the right, you have more birds in a reproductive hatchery. going through a developmental phase in some kind of containment area of a building or boat, right? And below it, look at what you have. You have scorpions, you have snakes, you have turtles. There are spiders on the other side of the same stone. Like it's marking out different levels, right? One level here, one level here. Here you have the birds that are hatching, that are reproducing, right? Because for Noah to gather together all the animals the way the Bible says, he would need time. And the Bible gave him, there's plenty of time in the biblical record to show that he could have done this. 40 or more years. Where did he keep all the animals? I believe he kept them right here at Göbekli Tepe. Look at the middle image. It's an overhead view of all these circular holding pens. That these stone monuments, these massive monoliths, mark out the exact type of creatures, birds, reptiles, cattle, creatures of the field, everything but fish and ocean creatures, which you wouldn't need in a flood, right? They're right here. They're not only right here, they're shown to be reproducing in different stages of development so they would know where to put them. They've dated the structure to about 12,000 years ago, but that's based on their dating of charcoal or wood fragments that could be of trees that were older and then cut down and used to burn at the time, or for different posts, but also because it was buried completely in sand. They've been digging this up by hand since the 1990s. Well, what moves sand? They come up with the craziest ideas about why it was buried, which is really no idea at all, right? I believe this was buried by the flood. What else could have moved that much earth to bury a place like that? Why would they bury a place like that? After going through all the trouble to erect, after carving massive stone monuments and engraving them with different images of the exact same creatures described in the Bible that Noah preserved in the ark. This is only a few hundred miles from where they believe the ark landed on Ararat. I don't know how much more of a reality you need than this. And if you do, I have it. Sunken cities all around the earth. And we have people that question us about the old earth and claim that the flood story of all things disproves the Bible. You know what it disproves? You don't know the Bible. You don't have a clue of the evidence that we do, that is evidence of the Bible's story of what happened. Because there's really no other explanation, is there, for how this could have happened? Or why? What, were they just spending all this effort and time in a Stone Age environment to mark out different creatures and holding areas? What, was it like a big zoo? And they just came and everyone walked around and observed creatures that they could see too? I don't think so. That doesn't fit the history of this planet. You know what does? A flood. A flood and a story about someone who survived that flood with all these animals and insects and birds. When the God of the Bible destroyed that earth. And that's why when the Bible talks about Noah and his faith, you've got reality all over the place. He showed godly fear, constructed an ark, saved his household. Through his faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that is according to faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed in going out to a place he was destined to receive as an inheritance. He went out, although not knowing where he was going. We'll get to Abraham more in a moment. But Abraham is from the city of Ur in ancient Mesopotamia, which is old, not as old as Göbekli Tepe. Mesopotamia was developed as the cradle of civilization after the flood of the earth. They don't have records that go back before Mesopotamia other than this, the remnants of the old earth. And that's why they call Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization, because after this civilization was destroyed and they came out from the ark, they then began to descend down into the area of Mesopotamia, exactly like the Bible says. Abraham was in Mesopotamia, and he was called out from there to go to another place, and by faith. Do you think he just left his homeland for no reason, atheists? Do you think ancient Abraham of ancient Ur just took off? We think he just took off and did it for no reason. No, that's not the story that's recorded for us. The story that's recorded for us is that the same God who appeared to people like Enoch and to people like Noah also appeared to Abraham and called him out of Mesopotamia. And that is why, not just because he had a thought in his mind, not because he didn't have an evidence-based hope. He had a God of reality, hypostasis, telling him where to go. By faith, Abraham resided as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, and dwelt in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the very same promise. Excuse me. For he, that is Abraham, was awaiting the city having real foundations, the builder and maker of which city is God, the same God who destroyed the earth that we can see remnants of, not only in these sunken cities, but in the places left for us that show the things he told people like Noah to do actually took place. They're not just some story, some legend without any evidence. By faith also Sarah herself received power to conceive seed even when she was past the age limit, since she esteemed him faithful who had promised. So we have a story here again, atheists, that's not based on just some hope without evidence. God appeared to Sarah, the angel of Jehovah, even after she had laughed at the idea that she would give birth at her old age. And she believed after that. And she regretted laughing in her heart. It wasn't just a thought. She believed that she would get pregnant at an old age because of the angel of Jehovah appearing to her on behalf of his father, telling her she should believe. That's evidence. Okay? That's not just a hope with no evidence. When a being like that appears to you and tells you something, whether you accept or not, atheist, isn't the point. The point is these examples of faith are on point because they were based on evidence that these individuals were presented with, and it doesn't have to be indisputable. In some cases it was, in our view. But either way, these are all examples of faith based on evidence. Hence also from one man and him as good as dead, talking about Abraham, there were born children, just as the stars of heaven for multitude, and as the sands that are by the seaside innumerable. In faith all these died, although they did not get the fulfillment of the promises, but they saw them afar off. They had hope, right? They didn't have the reality of the promises. They had hope, but was that hope without any evidence? No. The evidence was the same evidence that gave them faith in the first place. The appearance of God to them, telling them what to do, telling them she would give birth at an old age. And that gave them faith. And that faith gave them hope for the realities they didn't see, that they did see were the basis of that hope. You see? For those who say such things give evidence that they are earnestly seeking a place of their own. And yet, if they had indeed kept remembering that place from which they had gone forth, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they are reaching out for a better place, that is one belonging to heaven, the New Jerusalem, the place that was promised, that would descend as part of the new heavens and new earth we've been talking about in our recent videos. We're not going to get off onto it. Hence, God is not ashamed to call them. We're not getting into the full discussion of these different promises. We're just using this chapter to highlight in part the promises that were made to people who had faith for the realities that they beheld, and then the promises were the things they hoped for because they were evidence-based as well. Just not as much as the things that evoked their faith, because they were actually happening in front of their face. Whereas the promises were hoped for in relation to those things that they were observing. By faith, he is not ashamed to call them to be called their God, for he has made a city ready for them. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, as good as offered up Isaac, but we know he didn't offer him up, right? So as good as, because he went through the mental and emotional anguish of offering him up, he had to accept that he was going to give his son in response to this God who had appeared to him, even though that God who appeared to him wasn't going to let him do it. He needed to know that Abraham would do it, because all of this is for what? All of this promise is about what? Genesis 3:15, the seed. And in an imperfect state that we are in now and that Abraham was too, they needed to know what would be in the line of the ones who were chosen, so that the Messiah's body that was being developed through this people, through Abraham, would have everything necessary in order to endure the things that God was sending his son to endure as the last Adam, lower than the angels, to counteract what Adam did as someone lower than the angels but a perfect man, so that God could eventually be all things to everyone, just like he intended with that first man. And the man that had gladly received the promises attempted to offer up his only begotten, right? Because Isaac is the child of promise through Sarah, the only child of Abraham and Sarah, their only begotten, even though he had other children like Ishmael. Even though God has other sons of God, he only has one firstborn that he made directly. Proverbs 8, John 1:18, his only begotten, Trinitarians. Although it had been said to him, what will be called your seed will be through Isaac, right? So he had already been told this was going to happen, and yet now he's being told to sacrifice his son in order for that seed to eventually be the way it needed to be. God reckoned because he reckoned God was able to raise Isaac from the dead, right? So he knew this promise had been made about Isaac. But what? He had faith not only to leave Ur and to go to a foreign land, but he had seen this God make a promise to Sarah in ways that he accepted, together with all the things happening with the angel of Jehovah, so that he felt, well, if I have to give Isaac in sacrifice, something not uncommon in the ancient world, by the way, those of you who look down on this account and who look down on Abraham's faith, something actually quite common in that time and in those places, in many of those locations in ancient Mesopotamia. He figured if he offered him up, then God would raise him up and that the promise would be fulfilled. So that's based on what? The fact that God had already promised and done things to him that he had fulfilled. So it's not just, I'm just going to trust this God, and if he says offer up my son, so be it. You atheists fail to understand that not only did Abraham have reason for his faith, you not only fail to understand that this was more accepted as a practice at this time, you fail to read this text. Hebrews 11:19. Abraham thought, according to our belief, God would bring him back. Like right away. pretty much, in order to fulfill the promise about his seed. So Abraham wasn't like, I'm just going to throw my son away. He had faith based on all the spiritual encounters he was having and things he was being told. And of course, that all these other nations believed in all these other gods and were sacrificing to them for their faith. He had even more so because he was responding to the angel of Jehovah. These things were taking place as he did so. And so he felt, well then, this God will bring my son back. Abraham expected to get his son back. He wasn't just casting him away and figured he'd call it a day. Atheists and others who look down on this account have no idea what's going on in these accounts because they don't look at them. The same way they don't even often look at their own experiments in order to include themselves as the causal agent of what takes place. He reckoned that God was able to raise him from the dead, and from there he did receive him in an illustrative way, right? Because he already had gone through it in his mind. Well, he'll bring him back from the dead. So I'll respond to this God who's causing all these things to take place. So far, what he's saying is coming true. I'm having these miraculous experiences with the angel of Jehovah who speaks as this God too. So then, if he tells me he's going to make my seed as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sand of the sea, then he's going to bring my son back. So I'll do it. Make more sense now, atheists? It should, even if you're still atheists. By faith also Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when about to die, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning upon the top of his staff. Right? So Jacob, he already knew about these things related to his father and to his father's father, and was so closely involved with all the things happening with respect to them, he had faith. This wasn't someone who was making blessings and doing things apart from faith, from reasons, from evidence of things that had already taken place. By faith, Joseph, nearing his end, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel, and he gave a command concerning his bones. Did Joseph have faith? Look at all the things he went through and how God spared him and rose him up high in that place, a foreign land, where he became second to Pharaoh and really the one in command, and then brought his family who had betrayed him right before him so he could test them and then embrace them. And then they stayed with him in that land for many years before Jacob died. By faith, Moses was hid for 3 months by his parents after his birth because they saw. They didn't just think in their minds, well, this might be a special child. Maybe we should save it. They saw the young child was beautiful and they did not fear the order of the king. That takes faith, wouldn't you say, atheists? To disobey the order of Pharaoh the king? You might want to look at ancient Egyptian history if you don't think that would be something requiring faith. But it says right here, and we know from the account that they saw his face. Once the daughter of Pharaoh took a look at Moses and he had that exceptional beauty that Jehovah likely marked him with in order for her to recognize him and that beauty and to preserve him so that he could then bring him forth, further deliver his people, and eventually again the seed. By faith, Moses, when grown up, refused to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh, choosing to be ill-treated with the people of God rather than to have the temporary enjoyment of sin, because he esteemed the reproach of the Christ as riches greater than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked intently toward the payment of the reward. Moses obviously had many reasons, right? He not only observed the treatment of his brothers and those that he had records of in Egypt, not only of them, but of all the things that had taken place from Noah's descent forward, that were carried down through those people as they migrated and populated and repopulated, in my view, Egypt, because I think it was there before the flood took place, but that's not necessary for this discussion. My point is, the records were there with Moses, and he knew. He knew not only all the things that they knew, but he knew what he could see with the people, the Hebrews. And so he struck out when he saw them being struck, rather than enjoy the temporary pleasures of sin. And then he left Egypt, not fearing the order of the king, for he continued steadfast as seeing the one who is invisible. He was the one who then went out and left Egypt, because he knew if he went back after standing up for the Hebrews, that he would never leave Egypt, not alive. And then he had the encounter of his life. The angel of Jehovah speaking as Jehovah in the burning bush, and thereafter all the way through to the end of his life. Seeing the one who is invisible, right? We observe from the things seen the things that are not seen, just like Moses. By faith he had celebrated the Passover and the splashing of blood, that the destroyer might not touch their firstborn ones. Is firstborn literal here, Trinitarians? It is. Just like it almost always is, except for a couple figurative times, and neither of those times involve the firstborn of God, Jesus. By faith, when they passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but on venturing out upon it, the Egyptians were swallowed up. Moses, by this point, as I've already explained, had numerous encounters with Jehovah out of Egypt, and then going back to Egypt, and all the plagues, and all the things that took place, including the marking of their doors so that they would be spared, while the firstborn, the real firstborn ones of Egypt, were not. Passing through the Red Sea, realizing that even being cornered by Pharaoh and the Egyptian army, as tough as that might be, even after going through all that, right? It's hard to have faith all the time. It's hard to believe in the things we can't see. Even if we've seen so many things to this point, we say we believe, we still lose faith, just like the Hebrews did when they were at this place until Moses raised his staff and Jehovah split the waters so that they could pass, but the Egyptians could not. That took faith. That took them believing in things they could see in order to walk through that sea and believe the one they could not see. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled. Oh, Gobekli Tepe again. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Did it take faith, atheists, for the walls of Jericho that we can show today? I have a video on my channel that describes the archaeology that exists today, proving Jericho was there, proving the walls were there, proving the city was overtaken and destroyed, proving even that Rahab, who we'll read about in a moment, and the place that she said to have inhabited in that wall was there. And that they had provisions and things there necessary to withstand a siege until these walls came down. Did the Israelites encircle those walls for 7 days just because they thought they would come down? No. At that point, they had faith. At that point, they believed. And none of them objected to encircling that city like they were concerned with Pharaoh's army. At that point, they were still shaken, but at this point, they were convinced. And those walls came down. You can look up the archaeology and see if you're convinced. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish with those who acted disobediently, because she received the spies in a peaceable way. Again, I have a video on my channel. You can look it up in one of the playlists that talks about the history of the Bible and archaeology, or just look up the history and archaeology of Jericho. All of these things are supported by it. And they had evidence that was even more convincing, right? They had the things that they were using that had been given to them in these miraculous ways that were observable, that were the substance of their faith, the hypostases, the hope, right? They may have hoped that the walls would fall because they hadn't seen them fall yet, but their hope was based on what? Evidence. The reality of the things that they had seen convinced them to walk around that city 7 times in the hope, evidence-based hope, that the walls would come down. And what more shall I say? For the time will fail me if I go on to relate about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, as well as Samuel, and the other prophets. Trinitarians, break for a moment, just for you. Was Samuel a prophet? Well, then why does it separate him from the prophets? Is it wrong for NWT to use other in brackets there? We're going to talk about this more next week. And in other videos like in the Bible and the Trinity and Conflict series I have in Colossians 1, 15 through 17. But Trinitarians, let's break for you for a moment. Does your Bible use other here? If not, does that mean Samuel was not a prophet? So when NWT adds other, it's really not always bad, is it? Because it's meant to include Samuel with the prophets, just like the firstborn, defined for us in Deuteronomy 21:17 as the beginning of one's generative power or children, Hebrew, Septuagint, means that he's also a part of creation. He's the firstborn of creation. And so when it says that all things were made through him, it's obviously excluding him from being made through himself. You Trinitarians humiliate yourself with your ridiculous arguments sometimes. Just like you do here if you don't add other, or at least include Samuel with the prophets, because he was of that kind. Incredible. Who through faith defeated kingdoms in conflict, effected righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, stayed the force of fire, escaped the edge of sword, from a weak state were made powerful, became valiant in war. You think they did all that just for an idea or thought? Or do you think they were convinced? If they didn't have full faith, evoking the full level of trust that shows the reality exists, they certainly had hope that what they were doing would lead to a conclusion they could see based on evidence, not no evidence. They routed armies of foreigners. Women received their dead by resurrection, but other men were tortured because they would not accept release by ransom in order that they might obtain a better resurrection. The point he's making here in saying all these things is these people acted based on evidence. You can disagree, atheists, that they didn't have good evidence for these things. Just like we disagree with your evidence. Like in Miller-Urey's experiment, that amino acids could form on their own apart from intelligent life in early Earth's primitive atmosphere. We disagree with your theory in association with those facts. We don't think you have the evidence for your theory that those amino acids formed apart from intelligent life. We disagree with you. You can disagree with us. It doesn't mean we don't have facts that support our belief about this stuff. We can also show your theories don't have the evidence you think they do either. So not every single example we may point to is going to have the same degree of convincing evidence like I showed earlier in relation to things like the flood, right? So there's different levels of conviction. There's different degrees of invoked trust. Not all faith, not all hope is based on the same type of evidence, just like you and your theories about what you think is true. So we need to look at the evidence, don't we? That's the key. Not whether or not your theory relates to evidence or our belief about these things that they did out of faith were true. Let's look at the real evidence that we can show is true and that points to things that are consistent with our or your view. Yes, others received their trial by mockings and scourgings, indeed, more than that, by bonds and prisons. They were stoned, they were tried, they were sawn asunder, they died by slaughter with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins while they were in want, in tribulation, under ill treatment. Things people normally do when they have good reasons, not just for no reason. People don't usually, even if they're not good, the reasons that you would accept, they don't normally go through this much difficulty because of no evidence. And the world was not worthy of them. They wandered about in deserts, mountains, and caves, and dens of the earth. Yet all these, although they had witness borne to them through their faith, did not get the fulfillment of the promise, as God foresaw something better for us, in order that they might not be made perfect apart from us. So, I hope it's been made clear that ultimately, whether we're talking about scientific theory, scientific fact, it's not much different conceptually from Christian hope or Christian faith. At times we may simply disagree on the evidence on which their claim to be based, how that evidence is viewed. Sometimes we may be able to point out that that evidence is either not true or doesn't support your theory or even your fact. And you may be able to point out that some of our evidence doesn't really support our hope or our faith. But it's more than that. It's about not just the conceptual parallels between theory and fact and hope and faith. It's about the evidence that underpins those theories, facts, hope, or faith, and the conclusions that we reach according to the evidence that we can test, so that what we can teach is something that we can point to and say, you're missing this. You're not connecting that. That theory that you have, it doesn't explain that. When you say life can come from non-life, you don't have any evidence for that. That's a theory without evidence. Some of your other theories may have evidence, and we'll disagree with some of that evidence, or that your theory explains all that evidence. Just like the experiment involving Miller and Urey, and how even though they showed, after creating an apparatus, controlling the conditions, putting in the gases, the electrodes, all the things that were necessary to form amino acids, we disagree that those amino acids that formed in the way that they showed were done apart from living organisms. Because we can show that those amino acids never would have formed without intelligent life putting all those things together in the first place, controlling the conditions so that the things that resulted are absolutely the result of a living organism. And in the case of creation, just like we can show from the reality of life, the hypostases of the things we hope for, the faith that we have because of what we can see all over the place in life, only coming from existing life, means life is eternal. And while Miller and Urey are not eternal, because the things that they made do not require them being eternal, just like the things they made require intelligence, so does life.